The millionaire's son was in constant pain, a pain no doctor could explain, and a silence so loud it filled every corner of the mansion. One night, when no one was watching, I pulled something out of his head, and everything changed. But that moment came after years of being invisible, unheard and unloved. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old now. But this story begins when I was 48, standing in the marble foyer of a Fifth Avenue penthouse in Manhattan, clutching my worn leather purse and trying not to stare at the crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my yearly income. The smell of expensive perfume and fresh orchids filled the air. My uniform, a simple gray dress with white collar, felt impossibly small in that vast space. Richard Blackwood was a name whispered on Wall Street. His fortune came from decades of shrewd investments in the stock market, and rumor had it that part of his wealth now sat in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency ventures that most people couldn't even pronounce. His net worth was estimated in the hundreds of millions, maybe more. Money flowed through his life like water through a sieve, endless, thoughtless, abundant. But wealth, I learned, doesn't cure a child's pain. Little Jamie was 2.5 when I first held him. He was thin, pale, with dark circles under eyes too, knowing for his age. He cried constantly, not the healthy wails of a normal toddler, but soft, defeated whimpers that broke something inside me. The previous 3 nannies had quit. Mrs. Blackwood, Victoria, blamed it on incompetence. I soon realized they had simply given up trying to love a child whose parents barely acknowledged his existence. That first night, I sat in the nursery rocking chair, Jamie finally quiet in my arms, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Central Park stretched out below us like a dark ocean. I sang the lullabies my own mother had sung to me in our tiny apartment in Queens, back when love didn't need money to feel real. Jamie's tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I made a promise in that moment. A promise that would nearly destroy me and ultimately save us both. Richard treated me with the distant politeness reserved for useful objects. Victoria barely looked at me, too busy managing her social calendar and charity galas to notice her son's desperate need for affection. But Jamie and we found each other in the quiet spaces between their indifference. I was there for his first real steps across the nursery floor. I clapped with tears streaming down my face when he said Maggie before he ever said Mama. I kissed his scraped knees, read him stories until my voice was hoarse, and held him through nightmares that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sleep. The headaches started when Jamie was 3. At first, they dismissed it as typical toddler fussiness, but I watched him press his small palms against his skull, saw how he'd suddenly stop playing and just sit, overwhelmed by something we couldn't see. I begged them to take him to specialists. Victoria would wave me off with manicured nails. "He's fine, Margaret. Children exaggerate." But I knew better. 40 years of caring for children teaches you to read pain in their silences, their posture, the way they suddenly stop being children and become old before their time. Dr. Patterson, the family's pediatrician, ran every test imaginable. MRIs, blood work, neurological examinations, nothing. The headaches remained a mystery wrapped in Jamie's increasing withdrawal from the world. He stopped laughing. He barely ate. He'd flinch when anyone touched his head, even me. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in December. I remember because snow was falling outside, dusting the city in false innocence. Jamie had been crying for 3 hours straight, that soft, hopeless sound that meant he'd given up expecting anyone to help. Victoria had locked herself in her bedroom with a bottle of champagne and instructions not to be disturbed. Richard was in his study, managing his investment portfolio, tracking the rise and fall of his assets with more attention than he'd ever given his son. I found myself alone with Jamie's agony once again. I held him against my chest, feeling his small body shake with pain and exhaustion. That's when my fingers found it. A tiny, hard bump just above his left ear, hidden beneath his thick, dark hair. It felt wrong, foreign. I pressed gently, and Jamie screamed. I had discovered this same spot months earlier during one of our quiet moments together. But when I mentioned it to Dr. Patterson, he dismissed it as a minor bump from playing. When I brought it up to Richard, he looked at me like I was overstepping my bounds. Let the doctors handle medical concerns, Margaret. But tonight something was different. The bump was larger, more pronounced, and suddenly I knew, with the certainty that only comes from years of loving someone completely, that this was the source of Jamie's suffering. I carried him to the bathroom, the one space in that mansion where I felt safe to act without permission. Under the bright vanity lights, I could see it clearly now. A dark spot beneath his skin, almost like a splinter but deeper. How had everyone missed this? How had trained medical professionals overlooked something so obvious? With trembling hands, I gathered what I needed: tweezers from my sewing kit, rubbing alcohol, a flashlight. Jamie whimpered as I positioned him on my lap, but he didn't fight me. He trusted me in a way he trusted no one else in that cold, beautiful house. "Shh, my love," I whispered, using the endearment I'd never dared speak aloud before. "Maggie's going to help you feel better." The extraction was delicate, terrifying work. What I pulled from beneath his skin was indeed a splinter, a long, thin piece of wood that must have embedded itself months ago, so deep that it had become infected, causing pressure and inflammation that no amount of money could diagnose. It was nearly 2 inches long, dark with infection, a tiny piece of debris that had been torturing my boy for months. Jamie's relief was immediate and profound. The tension left his small body like air from a punctured balloon. For the first time in months, he looked at me and smiled. Really smiled with his whole face, with joy I'd forgotten he possessed. That night, he slept peacefully for 8 uninterrupted hours, and I sat beside his bed, holding that splinter in a tissue, proof of what love sees that medicine misses. In the morning, Richard found us in the nursery. Jamie was playing with his blocks, humming tunelessly, the picture of a healthy, happy child. Richard stared as if witnessing a miracle. "What did you do?" he asked. And for the first time since I'd known him, I heard something like respect in his voice. I showed him the splinter, explained how I'd found it, how I'd known it was the source of Jamie's pain. Richard held that tiny piece of wood in his manicured hands like it was evidence of his own failure as a father. "My God," he whispered, "all this time." But even miracles, I learned, couldn't bridge the gulf between our worlds. Victoria's reaction was swift and vicious. She accused me of overstepping boundaries, of performing medical procedures without training or permission. What if I had hurt Jamie? What if something had gone wrong? Her anger wasn't about Jamie's well-being. It was about a servant knowing her child better than she did, caring for him in ways her wealth couldn't purchase. "You're not his mother, Margaret," she hissed at me one morning, her perfect composure cracking just enough to show the ugliness beneath. "Don't forget your place." My place, as if love had a designated spot in their hierarchy of importance. The Whisper campaign started subtly, suggestions that I was becoming too attached, too involved. Other wealthy mothers at Victoria's charity events began asking pointed questions about the nanny who thought she was family. The seeds of doubt were planted carefully, watered with gossip and class resentment. I continued caring for Jamie, but now I felt eyes watching, judging, waiting for me to cross some invisible line that kept moving further away from human decency. Jamie thrived under my continued care. His headaches were gone. His laughter returned. He began asking for books, for trips to the park, for all the normal things healthy children crave. But my success became my crime. The accusation came on a rainy April morning. Someone, Victoria claimed it was a concerned friend, had suggested I might be inappropriately attached to Jamie, that I was undermining his parents' authority, that I was encouraging him to prefer me over his own family. The last part, at least, was true, but not because I had manipulated a child's love. It was because I had earned it through sleepless nights, patient days, and the kind of presence that money cannot buy. Richard, caught between his wife's social fears and his growing respect for me, chose the path of least resistance. On a Thursday morning, exactly 4 months after I'd cured his son's mysterious illness, he asked me to pack my things. "It's not personal, Margaret," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "Victoria feels... well, she feels it's best. What does a nanny take when she spent 6 years building a life around someone else's child? I had a room full of memories, but I could only pack what fit in 2 small suitcases. I took the drawing Jamie had made of us together at the zoo, 2 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. I took the book of lullabies I'd sung to him every night. I took the small wooden bird he'd carved for me in an art class, whispering that it was for Maggie because she loves me best. I left behind photo albums full of pictures I wasn't in, holiday videos that carefully edited out my presents, and 6 years of birthdays where I baked the cakes but never appeared in the celebration photos. Jamie found me packing. He stood in my doorway, still small for his age, but so much healthier than when I'd first held him. His dark eyes, Richard's eyes I'd always thought, were wide with confusion. "Are we going somewhere, Maggie?" he asked. "How do you explain rejection to a 5-year-old? How do you tell a child that the adults he trusts have decided his love is inconvenient?" "I'm going to live somewhere else for a while, sweetheart," I managed. "Can I come too?" The words shattered something in my chest that I didn't know was still intact. "No, baby. You need to stay here with Mommy and Daddy." He threw his arms around my waist, clinging with desperate strength. "But I need you, Maggie. Who's going to know when I'm sad? Who's going to sing the night songs?" I knelt to his level, memorizing his face, the freckles across his nose, the stubborn cowlick that never stayed flat, the way his left eyebrow raised higher when he was thinking hard. "You're going to be brave and strong, and you're going to remember that Maggie loves you very, very much." When Richard came to collect him, Jamie screamed. Not the polite protest of a well-behaved child, but the raw, desperate wails of someone being torn from their source of safety. I heard him calling my name long after the elevator doors closed behind me. I moved to a studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, a world away from Manhattan's gleaming towers, but somehow more real than the marble mausoleum I'd called home for 6 years. My new neighbors were working people like me, immigrants, single mothers, elderly folks on fixed incomes. No one asked why a nearly 60-year-old woman was starting over with 2 suitcases and a breaking heart. For the first few weeks, I could barely function. I'd wake up at 5:30, ready to prepare Jamie's breakfast, before remembering I had no child to feed. I'd catch myself humming lullabies in the grocery store, my body still programmed for bedtime routines I'd never perform again. The silence in my small apartment felt different from the wealthy silence of the Blackwood mansion. This was the silence of absence, not neglect. I found work with an elderly woman in the neighborhood, Mrs. Chen, who needed help with basic daily tasks. The pay was a fraction of what Richard had given me, but Mrs. Chen looked at me when she spoke. She said please and thank you. When I mentioned that I missed cooking for children, she shared stories about her grandchildren in California. It was the first real conversation I'd had in months. Meanwhile, I learned through the building's doorman, we'd become friends over the years, that the Blackwood household was struggling. Jamie's headaches hadn't returned, but other problems had emerged. He refused to eat meals that I hadn't prepared. He asked for me every night at bedtime. They'd hired a series of replacement nannies, but Jamie remained stubbornly uncooperative. Victoria's social events became exercises in damage control as Jamie's behavior grew increasingly difficult. He had tantrums at inappropriate moments, refused to perform the polite childhood tricks that impressed her friends, and began asking uncomfortable questions about where his real family lived. "He keeps saying his family is in Queens," the doorman told me one afternoon. "Keeps asking when he can visit his real home." The knife of that comment twisted in ways I hadn't expected. Jamie remembered. He considered my tiny apartment in Queens more home than his family's penthouse. But memory, I was learning, was a luxury that rich people's children weren't allowed to keep. Richard's business empire, built on calculated risks and shrewd investments, began to show cracks as his personal life crumbled. Distracted by problems at home, he made a series of poor decisions in the cryptocurrency market, losing millions in a single week. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who could predict market fluctuations with mathematical precision couldn't understand his own son's emotional needs. The call came 6 months after I'd left. Richard's voice on the phone sounded older, defeated. "Margaret, could we meet? I need to discuss Jamie." We met at a small cafe in Midtown, neutral territory between our two worlds. Richard looked terrible, thinner, grayer, wearing the kind of exhaustion that expensive clothes couldn't hide. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and struggled to find words that his wealth had never taught him. "He's not getting better," he finally said. "If anything, he's worse. The new nannies, they're professionally trained, they have degrees, but Jamie won't accept them. He keeps asking for you." I sat quietly, waiting. After 6 years of being dismissed and ignored, I wasn't going to make this easy for him. "Victoria thinks we made a mistake," he continued, and I could see how much those words cost him. "She's concerned about Jamie's emotional development. The pediatrician thinks he might be showing signs of attachment disorder." "Jamie doesn't have attachment disorder," I said quietly. "He had attachment, and you severed it." Richard flinched as if I'd slapped him. "I know, God help me, I know that now. But Victoria was so sure. She said people were talking, that it wasn't appropriate for a child to be so dependent on hired help." "Hired help?" I tasted the bitter familiarity of those words. "Is that what you thought I was? For 6 years?" "No," he said, and I was surprised by the honesty in his voice. "No, you were never just help to us. To Jamie. Certainly not. But Victoria, she has her position in society to think about, her reputation. And what about Jamie's well-being? Where did that rank in your hierarchy of concerns?" Richard was quiet for a long time, staring at his untouched coffee cup. When he looked up, I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before: humility. "We need you to come back," he said simply. "Jamie needs you. We all do, but especially Jamie." The vindication I dreamed of felt hollow when it finally arrived. "What's changed, Richard? Are you willing to stand up to Victoria's social fears? Are you prepared to treat me like a human being instead of convenient furniture?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes. Jamie is barely eating. He's not sleeping. Yesterday, he asked Victoria if Maggie was dead because nobody would talk about where you'd gone." The thought of Jamie wondering if I'd abandoned him, thinking I might be dead, nearly broke my resolve. But I'd learned something important in those months of exile. My own worth wasn't determined by their need for me. "I'll consider it," I said. "But things will be different this time. I won't be invisible anymore. I won't be excluded from family decisions that affect Jamie. And I won't be dismissed again just because Victoria's friends whisper things that make her uncomfortable." Richard nodded eagerly. "Anything. Whatever you want." "I want to be treated like what I am. The person who loves that child most in the world. The person who knows him better than anyone else. The person who's been his real mother since he was 2 years old." The words hung in the air between us like a confession we'd all been avoiding for years. "You're right," Richard whispered. "You've been more of a mother to him than anyone else. I'm sorry it took me so long to admit that." But admitting the truth wasn't enough to erase 6 years of systematic diminishment. As we talked, Richard outlined his plans to make amends. A substantial raise, better living quarters in the house, formal recognition of my role in Jamie's life. All the things money could buy, but none of the things it couldn't replace. "What about Victoria?" I asked. "Are you prepared to have this conversation with her, too?" Richard's hesitation was answer enough. She's adjusting to the idea. She understands now that Jamie's attachment to you isn't unhealthy. It's necessary. Understanding and accepting are different things, Richard. Will she respect my judgment about Jamie's needs, even when it conflicts with her social calendar? Will she stop treating me like a servant who's forgotten her place? "She'll have to," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath his determination. I didn't give him an answer that day. I needed time to think, to weigh my own emotional healing against Jamie's desperate need for stability. That evening, I called my daughter Maria in California, my own child who I'd raised as a single mother while working multiple jobs to keep us afloat. "Mama," she said after I'd explained the situation, "you gave that family 6 years of your life. You saved that little boy in ways they'll never fully understand. But what about you? What about your life, your dreams, your own healing?" Maria was right to worry. At 54, I wasn't young anymore. How many more years did I have to give? How much more of myself could I sacrifice on the altar of other people's family dysfunction? But then I thought about Jamie, confused and hurting, asking if his Maggie was dead. I thought about the promise I'd made that first night in the nursery, to love him completely, regardless of the cost. Some people might call it foolish. Others might say I was enabling a family's dysfunction by making myself indispensable. But I knew something they didn't. Sometimes love requires you to walk back into pain, not because it's wise, but because it's necessary. I called Richard the next evening. "I'll come back," I said, "but not as Jamie's nanny, as his family, with all the respect and recognition that implies." The reunion was everything I'd hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. Jamie spotted me through the penthouse windows as I crossed the lobby. Richard had insisted I use the main entrance instead of the service elevator, a small symbol of my changed status. By the time the elevator reached the 40th floor, Jamie was waiting behind the doors, practically vibrating with excitement and anxiety. "Maggie!" He launched himself at me with the force of 6 months' worth of stored-up love and fear. "I thought you were dead. I thought you forgot about me." I knelt in that marble foyer, the same space where I'd first felt so small and out of place, and held Jamie like I was trying to absorb all the pain we'd both endured during our separation. He was taller now, his face thinner, but healthier. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, but there was a wariness there that hadn't existed before, the caution of a child who'd learned that the people he loves most can disappear without warning. "I could never forget you, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair. "Never, ever, ever." Victoria stood at the edge of the foyer, watching our reunion with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not the cold dismissal I'd expected, but something more complex. Perhaps the recognition of a bond she'd never been able to create with her own son. "Welcome back, Margaret," she said stiffly, and I could hear the effort it cost her to acknowledge my return with anything approaching grace. The adjustment period was delicate, tense, full of unspoken negotiations about power and place within the family structure. Richard had kept his promise about my changed status. I now had a suite of rooms on the same floor as the family instead of quarters near the kitchen. My salary had doubled. Most importantly, I was included in all decisions regarding Jamie's education, health care, and daily routine. But money and better accommodations couldn't instantly repair 6 years of systematic exclusion. Victoria struggled with my enhanced role, especially when Jamie consistently turned to me instead of her for comfort, guidance, and affection. During dinner conversations, he'd look to me for permission before answering his parents' questions. When choosing weekend activities, he'd ask what Maggie wanted to do. When friends came to play, he'd introduce me as my Maggie who takes care of everything. The possessiveness in his language worried me, but it also revealed the depth of our connection. Jamie had organized his world around my presence, and my absence had taught him that love wasn't guaranteed. It had to be guarded, claimed, protected. "He can't keep treating you like his real mother," Victoria complained to Richard one evening, not realizing I was within earshot. "People notice. They comment." "And what would you prefer?" Richard asked, and I was proud of the edge in his voice. That he reject the person who's shown him the most consistent love in his life? That he pretend not to need the stability she provides? "I just think there should be boundaries," Victoria insisted. "Clear lines about whose family and whose—" She struggled with the words. "Who's what, Victoria? The woman who's loved our son unconditionally for 6 years? The woman who solved his medical mystery when trained doctors couldn't? The woman whose absence nearly broke him?" I didn't stay to hear more. The conversation told me everything I needed to know, that despite Richard's promises, despite Victoria's surface acceptance, the fundamental tension remained. I would always be the outsider who knew their child better than they did, the servant who'd transcended her designated role through the simple act of loving completely. But Jamie was thriving. Within weeks of my return, his appetite improved. His sleep became more peaceful. Most importantly, his capacity for joy returned full force, as if someone had restored color to a world that had gone gray during our separation. We fell back into our old routines, but they felt different now, more intentional, more precious. Our morning talks over breakfast carried the weight of everything we'd nearly lost. Our bedtime stories were infused with the gratitude of people who'd survived separation and found each other again. Even our quiet moments held more meaning, both of us acutely aware that love, even the deepest love, could be interrupted by forces beyond our control. The real test came during the Christmas season, traditionally the most challenging time for families trying to balance genuine emotion with social performance. Victoria was hosting her annual holiday party, a glittering event where Manhattan's elite gathered to display their wealth and strengthen their social networks. In previous years, I'd been invisible during these events, relegated to managing Jamie's schedule while the adults celebrated. This year would be different. "Margaret will join us for dinner," Richard announced to Victoria while reviewing the party arrangements, "as part of the family." Victoria's carefully controlled composure cracked slightly. "That's unusual, Richard. People will wonder." "Let them wonder," he replied. "Jamie considers her family. We should too." The night of the party, I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress I'd bought specially for the occasion. Nothing too flashy or attention-seeking, but appropriate for the elevated role I now occupied. Jamie insisted on escorting me into the dining room, his small hand tucked proudly into mine. "Everyone, this is my Maggie," he announced to the assembled guests with the unself-conscious directness of childhood. "She's the most important person in my family." The silence that followed was electric with social awkwardness. Wealthy people aren't accustomed to having their hierarchies challenged by 6-year-olds speaking uncomfortable truths. But Jamie's declaration forced everyone to acknowledge what they'd all chosen to ignore: that family isn't always defined by blood or legal documents. Mrs. Harrison, Victoria's closest friend and biggest gossip, leaned forward with predatory curiosity. "How wonderful that Jamie is so attached to his caregiver. Tell me, Margaret, how long have you been with the family?" The word caregiver was chosen deliberately, designed to remind everyone of my designated place in their social order. But I'd learned something important during my months of exile, that my worth wasn't determined by their recognition of it. "I've been loving Jamie for 6 years, I replied calmly. "Since he was 2 years old and desperately needed someone to see him as more than a problem to be managed." The directness of my response shifted something in the room's energy. Several guests looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own family dynamics in my subtle criticism. Richard raised his wine glass. Whether in support or to break the tension, I couldn't tell. "To all the people who love our children," he said, his eyes meeting mine across the table, "whether they're related by blood or chosen by the heart." Jamie beamed, understanding instinctively that his parents were finally acknowledging what he'd always known, that love creates family, not the other way around. The evening continued with typical wealthy people conversations: stock market fluctuations, real estate investments, political connections that could be leveraged for business advantages. But underneath the surface chatter, I could feel the shift in dynamics. I was no longer the invisible servant, but I wasn't quite an equal either. I occupied a new category that no one quite knew how to navigate: the hired help who'd become indispensable, the outsider who'd earned insider status through the simple act of loving a child completely. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Jamie was asleep, Victoria approached me in the kitchen where I was preparing his lunch for school the next day. "That was difficult for me tonight," she said, perching awkwardly on one of the breakfast stools. "Having you at the dinner table, I mean." I continued cutting Jamie's sandwich into triangles, the way he liked them, and waited for her to continue. "It's not that I don't appreciate everything you've done for Jamie," she said carefully. "It's that I don't understand my place in his life anymore. He runs to you when he's hurt. He asks for your opinion before mine. He trusts you with secrets he won't share with me." For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria sounded vulnerable instead of imperious. "He loves you," I said gently, because it was true despite everything. But love and trust are different things. Trust has to be earned through consistency, presence, reliability. You've been busy with other things. "I know," she whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I know I haven't been. I've prioritized the wrong things. Richard's business interests, my social obligations, everything except the most important thing." I stopped preparing Jamie's lunch and looked at her. Really looked. For perhaps the first time since I'd known her. Beneath the perfect makeup and designer clothes, I saw a woman who'd missed her own child's childhood while pursuing achievements that felt important, but ultimately weren't. "It's not too late," I said. "Jamie is 6 years old. He still wants his mother's love and attention, but it has to be real love, not performance love, not love that gets put aside when something more socially important comes up." Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes carefully to avoid smudging her mascara. "Will you help me? Will you teach me how to be what he needs?" The request surprised me. I'd expected continued resistance, passive aggression, social warfare designed to reestablish the hierarchy that had been disrupted by my return. Instead, I found a woman finally ready to admit that her child's emotional well-being was more important than her social standing. "Of course," I said, "but it means putting Jamie first, really first. Not first among your social obligations, but first in your life." From that night forward, our strange little family began to function differently. Victoria started joining Jamie and me for our morning breakfasts, initially awkward but gradually more natural. She began reading bedtime stories, not the educational books she thought he should enjoy, but the silly, repetitive stories that actually made him laugh. Most importantly, she began listening to Jamie's actual words instead of hearing what she thought a well-bred child should say. The transformation wasn't miraculous or complete. Victoria still struggled with putting Jamie's needs before her social calendar. She still felt competitive with me sometimes, uncomfortable with the depth of Jamie's attachment to someone who wasn't his biological mother. But she was trying, genuinely trying to become the mother Jamie deserved. Richard's evolution was subtler but equally significant. He began spending less time managing his investment portfolio and more time managing his family relationships. He scheduled regular father-son activities with Jamie, not educational experiences designed to develop useful skills, but purely fun adventures that created positive memories. He also began treating me with the respect of a true family member, consulting me on major decisions and including me in family plans. The financial pressures that had been building in Richard's business empire during the period of domestic chaos began to ease as his focus returned to making sound decisions instead of being constantly distracted by problems at home. His cryptocurrency investments, which had suffered during his months of poor judgment, began recovering as his attention became more disciplined and strategic. But the most significant changes were in Jamie himself. With his family finally stable and his place in it secure, he began to flourish in ways that went beyond basic happiness. His confidence grew. His curiosity expanded. He began making friends at school more easily, no longer clinging desperately to every relationship as if it might disappear without warning. One evening, about 8 months after my return, Jamie asked me a question that revealed how much he'd been thinking about our complicated family structure. "Maggie, why don't you have a little boy of your own?" I'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually as he became more aware of how families typically functioned. "I did have a baby once," I told him carefully, "but he went to heaven before he was born, and I never got to meet him." Jamie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness that children bring to important revelations. "So you love me like I'm your little boy?" he asked. "I love you like you're the most precious person in the world to me," I said, "which you are." "But I'm not really your little boy. I'm Mommy and Daddy's little boy who gets to borrow your love." The sophistication of his understanding broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. At 6 years old, Jamie had grasped the complex nature of our relationship in ways that had taken the adults years to acknowledge. "That's right, sweetheart. But borrowing love doesn't make it less real. It just makes it more special, because we chose each other. Like how you chose to pull that splinter out of my head when nobody else could find it." Exactly like that. Sometimes the people who love us most can see things that other people miss, even doctors and parents. Jamie snuggled closer to me on the couch where we'd been reading. "I'm glad you could see my hurt. I'm glad you made it better." "Me too, baby. Me too." As Jamie grew older, 7, then 8, then 9, our relationship evolved but remained central to his sense of security and identity. He began to understand more clearly the social complexities of our situation, the way other people sometimes looked confused when he introduced me as family, but his confidence in our connection never wavered. When he was 10, Jamie experienced his first real friendship crisis, a falling out with his best friend over some trivial playground dispute that felt earth-shattering in the moment. He came home devastated, convinced that he'd lost something irreplaceable through his own failure to be a good friend. Victoria tried to comfort him with logical explanations about how childhood friendships naturally change and evolve. Richard offered practical advice about conflict resolution and communication skills. Both responses were well-intentioned, but missed the emotional core of Jamie's pain. I found him later in his room, face buried in his pillow, shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that only comes with your first experience of friendship loss. "Tell me about it, love," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed and rubbing his back in the same circular pattern I'd used to comfort him as a toddler. Through tears and halting words, he explained not just what had happened with his friend, but his deeper fear, that he wasn't good at loving people, that everyone he cared about would eventually get tired of him and leave. "What if I'm broken, Maggie? What if there's something wrong with me that makes people not want to stay?" The question revealed how deeply my own temporary departure years earlier had affected him, creating a core anxiety about his worth as an object of consistent love. "Oh, sweetheart," I gathered him into my arms. This boy who was too old for such comfort, but still young enough to need it desperately. "You're not broken. You're not hard to love. You're the easiest person in the world to love. But people leave. he whispered against my shoulder. "Even you left once." I left because grown-ups made a mistake about what was best for everyone. I didn't leave because you were hard to love or because I stopped caring about you. I left because other people were scared of how much I loved you. Were you scared too? Terrified, I admitted. But not of loving you. I was scared of losing you, which is different. We talked for over an hour that night, about friendship, about love, about the ways people can hurt each other even when they care deeply. I shared stories from my own childhood, times when I'd felt rejected or misunderstood, helping him see that his pain was part of the universal human experience rather than evidence of his own inadequacy. By the time he fell asleep, Jamie had processed not just his immediate friendship crisis, but some of the deeper abandonment fears that had been shaping his approach to relationships. The next day, he called his friend and apologized for his part in their disagreement. The friendship was repaired, but more importantly, Jamie had learned that love, real love, survives conflict, misunderstanding, and human imperfection. These moments of emotional guidance and support happened regularly throughout Jamie's childhood, creating a foundation of trust and communication that would serve him well as he navigated adolescence and young adulthood. But they also constantly reminded Victoria and Richard of the unique role I played in their son's life. Not quite mother, not exactly nanny, but something deeper and more essential than either traditional category could capture. When Jamie turned 12, Richard made a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself. He established a trust fund in my name, not a typical employer's retirement contribution, but a substantial financial foundation that would ensure my security for the rest of my life. "You've given our family everything," he said when he presented me with the legal documents. "You saved Jamie's health, probably his emotional development, certainly his capacity for trust and love. This is our way of acknowledging that your contribution to our family can't be measured in traditional employment terms." The trust fund wasn't just money, though at nearly $2 million, it represented more financial security than I'd ever imagined possessing. It was recognition, validation, proof that my love and sacrifice had been seen and valued by the people who mattered most. But even more meaningful was the letter that accompanied the financial documents, written in Jamie's careful 12-year-old handwriting. "Dear Maggie, Daddy says this money is to make sure you can always take care of yourself the way you took care of me. But I want you to know that even if you didn't need to work anymore, I hope you'll still want to be my family. Because you're not just my nanny or my caregiver or any of those other words people use. You're my person. You're the one who sees me and knows me and loves me no matter what. I know I'm supposed to grow up and not need you as much, but I don't think that's true. I think I'll always need you, just in different ways. Thank you for pulling the hurt out of my head when I was little. Thank you for pulling the hurt out of my heart whenever it happens. Thank you for staying even when it was hard. Love, Jamie. P.S. I hope when I have kids someday, I can love them the way you love me." Reading Jamie's letter, I finally understood something that had taken me years to accept. That I hadn't failed as a woman because I'd never had biological children. I had succeeded as a human being by loving someone else's child so completely that he grew up knowing his worth, feeling secure in his connections, and understanding how to give and receive unconditional love. That night, I called my daughter Maria in California and read her Jamie's letter over the phone. "Mama," she said through tears, "you did raise a child. You raised him beautifully, and in doing that, you helped heal something in yourself, too." She was right. In loving Jamie, I discovered that motherhood isn't always about biology. Sometimes it's about choosing to see a child's need and deciding to meet it, regardless of social expectations or personal cost. Sometimes it's about pulling splinters from beneath the surface when everyone else is treating symptoms instead of causes. As Jamie moved through his teenage years, our relationship continued to evolve. He began to understand more fully the sacrifices I'd made, the social challenges I'd faced, The complexity of loving someone else's child in a world that didn't have clear categories for such relationships. On his 16th birthday, he gave me a gift that brought everything full circle. A small wooden sculpture he'd carved himself, depicting two figures sitting together reading a book. The larger figure had her arm around the smaller one, and both faces showed expressions of complete contentment. "It's us," he explained unnecessarily, "from all those nights when you read to me when I was scared or sad or just needed to know someone cared." The sculpture sits on my dresser now, 20 years later. Jamie is married, has children of his own, and works as a pediatric nurse. A career choice, he says, was inspired by watching me care for others with patience and precision. His own children call me Grandma Maggie, a title I never expected to earn but treasure more than any formal recognition. Victoria and I eventually became genuine friends, bonded by our shared love for Jamie and her gratitude for everything I'd given her family during their darkest period. Richard lived to see his grandchildren born, and before he died, he told me that hiring me was the best business decision he'd ever made because I'd invested in his family's emotional wealth when he'd only been focused on financial accumulations. But the real measure of success isn't in the trust fund or the awards or recognition I've received over the years. It's in the fact that Jamie grew up secure in love, confident in his worth, and capable of creating healthy, lasting relationships. It's in the way he's raising his own children with the same combination of high expectations and unconditional acceptance that I tried to give him. Sometimes people ask me if I have any regrets about the path my life took, about pouring so much of myself into someone else's family instead of focusing on my own needs and dreams. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the years of being treated as invisible, expendable, less than human. I regret the social isolation and the constant questioning of my own worth. I regret missing opportunities for my own happiness while I was focused entirely on everyone else's. But I don't regret loving Jamie. I don't regret pulling that splinter from his head when everyone else had given up looking for causes. I don't regret the sleepless nights, the patient days, the thousands of small acts of care that helped shape him into the man he became. Love is never wasted, even when it's not returned in equal measure. Love changes both the giver and receiver in ways that ripple forward through generations. The love I gave Jamie helped him become someone capable of giving that same quality of love to his own children, and their children will carry that legacy forward into a future I'll never see but helped create. Today I'm 83 years old and I live in a comfortable apartment near Jamie's family. I see his children regularly, help with homework and bedtime stories, and all the small daily acts that make up a life of loving service. But now, I also have time for my own interests: painting, reading, volunteering at the community center, maintaining friendships with people who see me as a complete person rather than just a caregiver. The balance feels right, finally. I learned to love without losing myself, to give without being depleted, to serve without being diminished. But there's more to this story than just my relationship with Jamie. In the years since his childhood, I've watched him navigate his own challenges with relationships, career, parenthood, all the universal struggles that define adult life. And in each crisis, each moment of uncertainty, I've seen how the foundation we built together continues to serve him. When Jamie was 25 and going through a difficult breakup with his college girlfriend, Sarah, he came to my apartment and cried on my couch, just like he had as a child. But now, instead of needing me to solve his problems, he needed me to witness his pain and remind him of his own strength. "I thought she was the one, Maggie," he said, his voice thick with the particular grief that comes from having your future plans suddenly erased. "I thought we'd get married, have kids, grow old together. How did I get it so wrong?" I made him tea, the same chamomile blend I'd given him for childhood stomach aches, and sat beside him, offering the kind of presence that had always been my greatest gift. "Love isn't always meant to last forever," I said gently. Sometimes love's purpose is to teach us something important about ourselves, or to prepare us for the love that will last. You didn't get it wrong. You loved completely, which is never wrong, even when it doesn't end the way you hoped. But how do I trust my judgment again? How do I open my heart when it might just get broken again? These were the questions I'd once asked myself after losing the baby I'd never gotten to hold, after years of loving other people's children who could be taken from me without warning. They were the eternal questions of anyone who'd risked everything for love and lost. You trust it because closing your heart is worse than having it broken, I told him. You know this. You've lived this. Remember when your parents made me leave when you were 5? You could have decided then that love wasn't safe, that caring about people was too risky, but you didn't. You kept loving, kept trusting, kept believing that connection was worth the risk, that wisdom didn't come from avoiding pain, it came from surviving it. Jamie was quiet for a long time, absorbing this truth he'd intellectually known but needed to hear from someone who'd witnessed his emotional evolution from the beginning. "What if I never find someone who loves me the way you do?" he asked, and I heard in his voice the same vulnerability he'd shown as a small child, afraid of being abandoned. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, pulling him close despite his adult size and strength. "You will find someone who loves you differently than I do, but just as deeply. And you'll love them in ways you've never loved before. The capacity for love that we built together, that doesn't diminish when it's shared with more people. It expands." 6 months later, Jamie met Elena, a pediatric physical therapist who shared his passion for helping children heal. I knew she was different from his previous girlfriends the moment he brought her to my apartment. He didn't seek my approval of her. He simply wanted me to know her, to see how happy she made him, to witness this new chapter of his emotional life. Elena treated me with the immediate warmth and respect that indicated Jamie had prepared her well for our relationship. She didn't seem threatened by our connection or confused by its unconventional nature. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about Jamie's childhood, laughed at stories about his stubborn phases, and genuinely seemed to understand that loving him meant accepting all the people who had shaped him. "Jamie talks about you constantly," she told me during their second visit. "He says you taught him how to recognize real love by showing him what it felt like to be completely accepted for who he was." "He taught me just as much," I replied honestly. "Maybe more. Loving him taught me that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about choosing to show up for someone consistently, especially when it's difficult." When Jamie and Elena got engaged 3 years later, he asked me to walk him partway down the aisle alongside Victoria. It was an unprecedented request that initially caused some family tension. "People will think it's strange," Victoria worried during the wedding planning, having the nanny participate in such an important family moment. But Jamie stood firm. "She's not the nanny anymore, Mom. She hasn't been for 20 years. She's family. She's the person who taught me what love looks like, what commitment means, what it feels like to be valued completely. If you can't understand why she needs to be part of the most important day of my life, then you haven't been paying attention to who I am." The wedding ceremony was beautiful, but what moved me most was Jamie's vow to Elena. "I promise to love you the way I was taught to love, completely, consistently, without conditions or reservations. I promise to see you when you can't see yourself, to pull out the splinters when you're hurting, and to stay even when it's difficult, because that's what real love does." I cried openly as he spoke those words, hearing in them the echo of everything we'd built together, all the late-night conversations and patient explanations and quiet moments that had shaped his understanding of what commitment really means. After the ceremony, Elena hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for raising the man I fell in love with." Jamie's children, Sarah, born 2 years after the wedding, followed by twins Michael and Emma 3 years later, call me Grandma Maggie. They know the story of how I helped their daddy when he was little and sick. They know that families come in all different shapes and that love is what makes people belong to each other. Watching Jamie parent his own children has been one of the greatest gifts of my old age. He does it with the same intuitive understanding of children's emotional needs that I tried to model for him. He reads bedtime stories with complete attention, comforts nightmares with patient presence, and treats each child's feelings as valid and important. When 4-year-old Sarah had chronic ear infections that weren't responding to treatment, I watched Jamie persistently advocate for additional testing until they discovered an unusual anatomical issue that required minor surgery to correct. The doctors had been treating symptoms. Jamie insisted on finding the cause. In that moment, I saw the direct line from the scared little boy whose splinter I'd extracted to the fierce father who wouldn't accept "we don't know" as a final answer. "You taught me to keep looking when something doesn't feel right," he told me afterward. "You taught me that loving someone means trusting your instincts even when experts tell you you're wrong." The twins, Michael and Emma, are now 5 years old, and they have completely different personalities and needs. Michael is sensitive, artistic, prone to being overwhelmed by noise and chaos. Emma is bold, physical, always ready for the next adventure. Jamie parents each of them according to their individual natures, never trying to force them into identical molds. "Remember how you used to tell me that every child is like a different language?" he said during one of our regular Sunday dinners. "You have to learn how each one communicates and what they need to feel secure." I use that with my kids every day. But perhaps the most profound validation of everything we built together came during a family crisis 2 years ago. Elena was diagnosed with breast cancer during a routine screening. The diagnosis was caught early, the prognosis was good, but the treatment would be aggressive: chemotherapy, radiation, possible surgery. Jamie could have crumbled under the weight of potentially losing the person he loved most. Instead, he became the rock his family needed, coordinating medical care, managing household logistics, supporting Elena through her worst days, and helping the children understand what was happening without frightening them unnecessarily. "How are you staying so strong?" Elena asked him one evening when I was visiting during her treatment. She'd just finished a particularly difficult round of chemotherapy and was exhausted, scared, struggling with the uncertainty of her diagnosis. "I learned early that love isn't just about the easy times," Jamie replied, gently brushing her hair. What little remained after treatment. "I learned that real love shows up most when someone can't take care of themselves." I watched Maggie do this for me every day for years. She loved me when I was sick and scared and difficult. She stayed when other people might have given up. Now it's my turn to be that person for you. Elena recovered fully. The cancer is gone. But watching Jamie navigate that crisis taught me something important about the long-term effects of childhood love. The boy, who'd been consistently nurtured through his own medical mystery, had grown into a man capable of providing that same quality of care to others when they needed it most. As I write this, I'm 87 years old. My health is good, my mind is clear, but I'm acutely aware that I won't be here forever. The children I helped raise are middle-aged now, raising children of their own. The legacy of love we created together continues to ripple outward in ways I never could have imagined when I first held a sick toddler in a Manhattan penthouse. Last month, Sarah, who's now 10, came to my apartment upset about a problem at school. A group of girls had been excluding her from their games, making her feel unwanted and confused about friendship dynamics. "Grandma Maggie," she said, curling up next to me on the same couch where I'd comforted her father 30 years earlier, "why are some kids so mean? Why do they make you feel bad for no reason?" "Some people hurt others when they're hurting inside themselves," I explained, using words I'd once spoken to her father during his own friendship crisis. "It doesn't make it okay, but understanding it can help you not take it personally. And sometimes, the kids who seem meanest are actually the ones who need kindness the most." But how do I know when to be kind and when to protect myself? She asked. It was such a sophisticated question for a 10-year-old, but children today seem to mature faster in their emotional understanding, perhaps because parents like Jamie are more willing to have honest conversations about complex feelings. You can be kind from a safe distance, I told her. You can hope good things for people who've been mean to you without trying to be their best friend. And you can always walk away from situations that make you feel small or bad about yourself. Sarah listened, processing this advice with the same serious attention her father had always given to our conversations. Later, when Jamie picked her up, she hugged me extra tight. "Thank you for helping me understand," she whispered. "Daddy always says you're the best at explaining hard things." After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about the strange, wonderful way that love multiplies across generations. The patience I'd learned to have with Jamie's childhood fears was now being passed through him to his children. The emotional vocabulary I'd helped him develop was becoming the foundation for his parenting. The security he'd found in our relationship was enabling him to create that same sense of safety for his own family. This, I realized, is why the difficult years were worth it. This is why the social dismissal, the professional uncertainty, the personal sacrifices all made sense in the end. Love is never truly wasted. Even when it seems unreturned, unrecognized, or undervalued, it creates ripples that extend far beyond what the original giver can see. But I also want to be honest about the challenges of growing older, when your primary identity has been built around caring for others. As my physical abilities have diminished and my role in Jamie's family has naturally evolved, I've had to learn who I am beyond the person who solves other people's problems. For the first time in my adult life, my time belongs entirely to me. I can read all day if I want to. I can take painting classes, join book clubs, travel to places I always wanted to see but never had time for. I can make friends based on shared interests rather than shared caregiving responsibilities. It's been surprisingly difficult to learn how to live for myself after decades of living primarily for others. But it's also been liberating in ways I didn't expect. I've discovered parts of my personality that never had space to emerge when all my energy was focused on meeting everyone else's needs. I've started writing. Not just this story, but poetry, essays, memoirs of other families I've worked with over the years. I volunteer at a local literacy program, helping adult immigrants learn to read English. I've joined a community garden where I grow vegetables that I actually get to eat instead of cooking them for other people. Most surprisingly, I've developed a close friendship with another woman, Dorothy, who also spent her career as a domestic worker for wealthy families. We meet for coffee every Tuesday, sharing stories about the strange world we inhabited for so many years, the invisible labor, the complex emotional attachments, the way we learned to love without being loved back in equal measure. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd chosen different paths? Dorothy asked me recently. If we'd focused on our own families, our own dreams, instead of pouring ourselves into other people's lives? I considered her question seriously. It's one I've asked myself many times over the years, especially during the hardest periods when I felt taken for granted or dismissed. I think about it sometimes, I admitted. But then I see Jamie with his children, or I watch how he and Elena support each other through difficult times, and I know that the love I gave wasn't wasted. It transformed into something bigger than either of us could have created alone. But what about your own happiness? Dorothy pressed. What about the life you didn't get to live because you were so busy living everyone else's? This is my life, I said. The choices I made, the love I gave, the family I helped create. That's all mine too. Maybe it doesn't look like the traditional path, but it's been rich and meaningful and full of purpose. I have no regrets about loving completely, even when it was difficult. And that's true. Despite everything, the social challenges, the professional uncertainties, the personal sacrifices, I wouldn't change the fundamental choice I made to love Jamie completely. That love created family in the deepest sense, bonds that have enriched all our lives in ways that continue to unfold. As I finish writing this story, I can hear children playing in the courtyard outside my apartment building. Their laughter sounds exactly like Jamie's did when he was small, before the headache stole his joy away. It reminds me that somewhere, right now, there are other children who need someone to see them completely, to love them without conditions, to pull out the splinters when everyone else has stopped looking for causes. And somewhere, there are other women like me, women whose own dreams of motherhood were interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, women who found purpose in loving other people's children, women who built families through choice rather than biology. To those women, I want to say this: your love matters. Even when it's not recognized, rewarded, or returned in equal measure, it matters. The children you care for, the families you serve, the communities you strengthen through your quiet acts of devotion, all of it has value that extends far beyond what you can see. Don't let anyone tell you that hired help can't become family. Don't let social expectations limit the depth of connection you're capable of creating. Don't apologize for loving completely, even when others judge the appropriateness of your attachments. The splinters you pull from children's heads and hearts, the comfort you offer during midnight fears, the patient presence you provide during developmental struggles. These are the building blocks of human resilience. You're not just taking care of children, you're creating the emotional foundation that will shape their capacity for love and trust for the rest of their lives. And you, have you ever loved someone who wasn't biologically yours, with the fierce protectiveness of a parent? Have you ever solved a problem that trained professionals missed because you cared enough to keep looking? Have you ever been dismissed or undervalued by people who benefited from your love? Tell me your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear from others who understand that family is created by choice and sustained by commitment, not just defined by blood or legal documents. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It helps us reach other women who pour their love into children who need them, regardless of official relationships or social recognition. And for more stories about the complicated beauty of chosen family and unconditional love, check out our special podcast by clicking the link on the left. Thank you for listening to this journey of the heart. I'll see you again soon, ready to share another story about the ways love transforms us all.